Now you should see something.
Yes, we're all good to go.
Okay. So, yeah, I would like to report today on marine palynology, of the palynology on the marine side, that shows some insight in the vegetation development in the southwest South Africa. Zhao, she analyzed a part of the Pliocene of this record, and I did the last 300,000 years of the Pleistocene. But before I start, let me acknowledge our co-collaborators, the palynologist Andreas Koutsoudenders from the University of Heidelberg, the paleoceanographers Thibaut Calais of the University of Bordeaux and Chris Charles of Scripps Oceanic Institute, the mammal bone specialist Tyler Faith of the University of Utah, and David Brown, archaeologist of the University of Washington. The material was retrieved in the International Ocean Discovery Program Expedition 361 a couple of years ago and concerned South African climates. And the core I will report on is this one, just 1479, just off the south tip of South Africa. Now, you all know it is a very interesting region and with marvelous archaeology along the coast, but more important to this study is, of course, what you all know, the unique and very diverse type flora. I just give some pictures from the literature. You recognize the dwarf shrub and semi-succulent shrubs on the top left, and fynbos, top right, dune thicket that may go into forest in the middle, and grasslands and wetlands at the bottom. Also, the vegetation map very clearly shows how diverse the vegetation here is, and it is mainly dependent on the soil structure and on the rain seasonality of precipitation. So you have the winter rainfall zone with, in the drier parts, the succulent karoo, and in the wetter parts, Strandveld, fynbos, and Renosterveld. You have in the eastern part where the rain falls during the summer. You have the desert, the semi-deserts of the Namakaroo, and the grasslands and forests and thickets more east where it's a bit wetter. And between that is the transitional zone of the year-round rainfall zone, with also very diverse with fynbos, with Renosterveld, with grassland and with thickets. Now, the position of the site. This shows its relation to the winter rainfall zone and the year-round rainfall zone. I also denoted the Gallus current, its retroflexion, and the rings. And what is also very typical of this area, that you have a large submerged shelf now that gets emerged during sea level low stands in the Pleistocene. And therefore, last year, a full issue of Quaternary Science Reviews was dedicated to the ecosystem of this now submerged plain, the Paleogallus plain. And Haley Cawthor and co-workers made a geological map by all kinds of means, from diving to seismics. And from that geological map, they derived a soil map. And you see here coastal dunes along the coast of the last glacial maximum. You see the meandering rivers and broad floodplains, and you see different types of soil. And these types of soil have been very important in the modeling of the vegetation which could have grown on the Paleogallus plain, what Cowling and others did. The soil map was a very important thing, but they also thought about lower CO2 during last glacial maximum and also lower temperatures. Another important assumption in this modeling is that they assume that fires would have swept strongly over the flat plain and thus precluding the growth of tall forest. You see here the different types of fynbos maps in blue and red and purple. In lilac you see a renoster veld vegetation mapped. In brown on the floodplains, floodplain woodland, and in yellow the grassland, the open grasslands. Now the pollen that decided to receive terrestrial stuff from mainly probably from the rivers that discharge on the south coast and then are then transported by ocean currents to the site, and also and in low sea level, low stands, then these rivers would flow over the Agulhas plain and also deliver pollen to the site. The winds, as you know, are the westerlies, and they won't bring much pollen as they pass over the ocean, but the site was still very rich in pollen, underlining the importance of pollen transport by the rivers in this region. Now here I compare that map of Gowland I showed before, and I compare it with the summary pollen diagram of the upper 300,000 years of the site. Here's the Holocene at the left and little over 300,000 years at the right. I try to make some match with the map. I grouped the pollen types and try to color code them as much as possible to what I think they might derive from the different fynbos and other vegetation types as shown in the map. Here in green, under the isotope curve and the sea level curve, you see the pollen from thicket and forest. That contains mainly podocarpus pollen, and as you know that podocarpus trees produce lots of pollen, the forest record is overrepresented. If the forest is over, the podocarpaceae are overrepresented in this type of diagram. Still, I think that for instance, in this area between 75 and 115,000 years ago, there must have been more forest on the plain than what is now modeled for the LGM for this site. Another difference with the modeled map, with the vegetation map, is the relatively low amounts of grass pollen I found here in pale yellow. But on the other side, the open grasslands are especially modeled for the eastern part, so they might have not some strong impact on the marine record far to the west. Well, of course, you would have a strong change in vegetation during termination when sea level quickly rises. And here I made a selection of pollen percentages of curves that show a strong response around these terminations. And they are grouped from early responses at the bottom to late responses at the top. And I will focus on the termination 2 at the beginning of the last interglacial. You have especially Asteraceae during the glacial, and also Letopappus from the Renosterveld and Anthospermum. And then on the termination, when it is quickest, you find Aesoaceae pollen and also some pollen from Gigalaria, probably, at least from the thickets. During the interglacial, there are more forest and thicket pollen from forest and thicket, and at the end, just after the interglacial, we find lots of podocarpus pollen. Now, extension of asteraceous and ericaceous rich fynbos on the palaeoclimate plain would explain the correlation of both of the pollen types of Ericacea and Asteracea with the sea level curve. And on the right-hand side, you see spectral analysis of the accumulation rates of the Asteracea pollen top and the Ericacea pollen at the bottom. And in these spectral analysis powers is plotted against frequency. And you can see that in both pollen records there is a strong precession signal. I come to that later, but there is also here in the thin blue arrow there's an obliquity rhythm, and I think that's something to do with this emergence and submergence of the Agolas plain. If you look at the spectral analysis of grass pollen, of the accumulation rates of grass pollen, you also see a precession signal, strong, but and you see an obliquity rhythm, but it seems nothing, when you look at the percentages, it seems to have nothing to do with sea level change. But therefore I compare it here with the latitudinal insolation gradient during summer, and that's strongly related to obliquity. Because when obliquity is weak, is low, the summers at the higher latitudes are colder, and therefore the gradient, the latitudinal gradient, is high, and this would drive a poleward moisture flux. This is an idea of Ramo and co-workers already published in 2003. And it seems as if the grass pollen record reacts on that. On the other hand, the Podocarpaceae pollen record doesn't show any obliquity, but just precession signal. And therefore I compare it here, the percentages of the Podocarpaceae pollen, with the latitudinal insolation gradient during winter, which has a strong precession signal and is high when precession is low, and vice versa. The Podocarpus percentage actually match very nicely with this record, with the precession, and even show some of the amplitudes match. So there are more Podocarpaceae pollen when precession is high, and therefore I show you here the results of a sensitivity experiment with the fully coupled model. Fully coupled atmosphere ocean model of EC Earth. What they did is they made anomalies, different plots between maximum precession and minimum precession, here in the temperature at the right hand side, and for precipitation at the left hand side. And you see that when precession is high, if maximum, the South Africa gets much warmer, and the precipitation is higher in most of tropical Africa when precession is high. That means that the summer rainfall zone of South Africa gets wetter during periods of maximum precession. And that might also be, and you see on the left-hand side, the vector areas for wind. They indicate that the westerlies, they remain westerlies, but they were much weaker. That also means that the winter rainfall zone got probably less moisture, so that the summer rainfall might have extended more westward to the coast, and that might have been favored the growth of podocarpus trees and other forests. So now I go quickly to a comparison with the Pliocene part of the record. So the And we have discussed now this part, and the Pliocene part that Xueqin analyzed runs from something from over 3,300,000 years to almost 2,850 years. And obvious is that there's much more Restoraceae pollen here in purple than in the Pliocene. On the other hand, there's much more Podocarpus pollen in the Pleistocene than in the Pliocene. There's also more Asteraceae pollen, and there's more Stipe Electropappus pollen grains in the Pleistocene, and also more dwarf and succulent pollen from dwarf and succulent plants. But it's also obvious that the precession rhythm is already there in the Pliocene, but not yet the obliquity rhythm. And that is not so surprising because, of course, the sea level changes were much smaller in the Pliocene. So we think I think these data point to that it might be that in the Pliocene the winter rainfall was extended, and about the variability, I showed made a comparison between the Pliocene on top and the Pleistocene for two selected species pollen accumulation rates of Podocarpaceae, the left-hand side, left-hand side, and Ericaceae at the right-hand side. And the only group where obliquity rhythm turns is here in the Ericaceae for the Pleistocene, and that might, as said, something to do with the emergence and submergence of the Paleoagalus plain. And the Pliocene part shows a stronger rhythm than during the Pleistocene for precession, and we think that that is something to do with the temperature gradient during winter. And that might work as follows. The temperature gradient follows the insolation gradient. And the insolation gradient, the southern hemisphere winter, is large when precession is low, during precession minima. When the gradient is large, you have stronger westerlies, and that bring more rain to the winter rainfall zone. On the other hand, during precession minima, the rainfall in the summer rainfall zone is smaller. Conversely, when precession is maximum and the insolation gradient is low, as in the left-hand figure, then the southern westerly is probably weaker, bring less rain to the winter rainfall zone, but on the other hand, the southern rainfall zone, the summer rainfall zone gets more rain and has more influence on the south coast. So I think there is some sort of a balance between the extension of the winter rainfall zone and the summer rainfall zone, and that is strongly influenced by the strength of the westerlies and the strength of precession. Now, that was about what I want to say. Quickly, my conclusions. This IDP site, U1479, provides a continuous pollen record of the Pliocene and the Pleistocene. And there is still, people could, well, I won't do it anymore. I retire in a few weeks, but there could be a wonderful record of all kinds of things to do on that core. Up till now, we have only analyzed, we have analyzed most of the late Pliocene and the last 300,000 years Pleistocene. From that, we think that fambos and Afro-temperate forests respond to precessional forcing of climate. So both in the Pliocene and the Pleistocene, and probably much earlier or always. And especially on the Paleoagalus plain, during sea level low stands, there might be an ericaceous-rich and asteraceous-rich type of fibers growing there. And I thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Lydie. That was great. And wow, you're retiring soon. I can't believe it. That's quite something. Sure.
It is wonderful material. It is, I was very surprised that when I saw the first pilot study, I saw that it was so well preserved and so rich, actually, for marine stuff. It is really, and here you have that. Of course, it is far away. It is not very local, but it is continuous. And it's got good dating, and also for the Middle Pleistocene, all kinds of things to do there.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Question, Brian?
Sure, I have a question. Why not?
Yeah.
I just turned this on so she wouldn't feel all alone. But yeah, so taphonomy, right? So, I mean, obviously, where you are is it's not as bad as the West Coast, but it's not quite as good as the Limpopo either in terms of transport vectors. But there, just looking at the precessional signal in the Podocarpus, it strikes me that precessional records that retain their precessional signal throughout a glacial cycle are actually quite rare if they're not linked to remote sources, right? And so there's Margit's record from ODP 1006, whatever, that has a really nice precessional tempo to it. And yours strikes me as being the same type of thing.
Yeah. And
one thing that I've always thought about hers, because that's terrestrial discharge, which is related to essentially river discharge, obviously. And considering where Podocarpus grows, oftentimes, obviously there's that big Neisner forest region, but often it's restricted to the kloofs where you have less drought. Sorry, I've been in France too long. Where you have less impact. You have more humid conditions more often, just because of aspect and water availability. And I wonder if that precessional signal isn't in part driven by changes in floodwaters coming through those vectors, through those river systems. So sort of to what extent might your source area change, and might there be another drummer kind of beating that precessional drum that isn't necessarily tied specifically to westerlies or easterlies or more or less rainfall, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I think it's there's certainly in accumulation rates and transport thing.
Yeah.
But I think that it is all coupled. I think that if you get more rainfall in the summer rainfall part, or if it even gets more to the west, then that part also produces more transport. The rivers are more. So that is certainly coupled, but I did a lot more playing around with the spectral analysis, and it stays that. So this is of course very strong in the accumulation rate, and that means also that if you look at the Pleistocene record, all pollen grains have the same rhythm and also all about the same phase angle.
Yeah.
So, but if you do the spectral analysis for the percentages, then you see only the same signal in the Podocarpus, and all the others that are then dependent from each other.
Yeah.
They switch 180 degrees in there. So yeah, that's more or less one of the reasons why I think that in the case we see a double signal, and that maybe it's therefore it's so strong. We see more possibilities for the trees, but you also see much more transport of that pollen.
Compounded, yeah.
Great. I'm going to have to cut you short there. It's time for Wendy. If she can just jump back on there. And whenever you're ready, go for it.
Hi everyone. Is this audible? Just a quick check.
Yeah.
Cool. My name is Wendy Khumalo. I'm a master's student at the University of Cape Town. I think I'm just doing this sort of beginning part as a little bit of a disclaimer. Obviously, we've just had Lydie Dupont make an amazing presentation and talk that's quite heavy and intensive on pollen. I'm in the geology department. So this is sort of just my first stepping out and dipping my toe into pollen and reconstructing climates or anything of that sort. So my project in its totality is sort of looking at archaeological sites, specifically Boomplaas Cave and Elands Bay Cave, to reconstruct the paleoclimate there from the last glacial maximum to present, in order to sort of get an understanding of the change in southern hemisphere westerlies. And this project is supervised by Dr. Robyn Pickering and Dr. Vincent Hare, who I think is on this call, this Zoom meeting. So let me just skip to the next slide. So as I've said, the two sites that we're looking at is Elands Bay Cave and Boomplaas Cave, and sort of a similar map was shown in the previous talk. This is sort of South Africa and the winter seasonality index, which is sort of an adjusted seasonality index. The blue indicating winter rainfall zone, the green a year-round rainfall zone, and the red a summertime rainfall zone. The two pictures on the right are just pictures of Elands Bay Cave. Those are the only two caves. That's the only cave, unfortunately, that I've been able to go to because of not being able to do much field work. The location of these caves has been quite important as well, because we're trying to track sort of a change in southern hemisphere westerlies. A winter rainfall zone and year-round rainfall zone would be the two important areas to be looking at, right? So looking at these two, what we also wanted to see is if perhaps we could see a change in seasonality from the last glacial maximum to present. Again, I'm sure so many people here are very tired of seeing things like pollen diagrams, but I have only seen very few in my life. So here's sort of adapted versions from the records that we decided to use for this project. We're going to be using the Deacon et al. From 1982 record that has the pollen from Boomplaas, and the Parkington et al. From 2000 that has the charcoal record from Elands Bay Cave, as well as the pollen record. So both of these sites obviously span from before the LGM to present, none of them quite hitting the 21,000 mark exactly where we wanted it, 21,000 being taken sort of from the climate models and how they define the last glacial maximum. So methods for this, the first part of the methods were sort of twofold. The first part is collecting a reference data set for all the flora that was identified. Because we're taking from published records, the flora is identified at different levels, species, genus, family level, throughout all three of these records that we're using. And what I basically did is use the Global Biodiversity Information Facility to draw these individual identified taxa from the literature. So this is three examples here: Protea nitida, Ficus sur, and Passerina. And basically what I wanted to show here is the difference in distribution at either species level and even within species, as well as at genus level. So something like Protea nitida, which has occurrences mostly in the sort of western and southern part of South Africa, southwestern part of South Africa, and your Ficus sur, which has occurrences throughout quite a lot of the coastline of South Africa and a little bit more north towards Limpopo. And Passerina, because it is not, specifically at species level, has a much wider distribution, but also has pockets where it occurs in higher, values. So what GBIF does is it gives you coordinates for all these occurrences of the different species. So we took all of those, and for Boomplaas Cave, with all the taxa, we had about 35,000 different coordinates. With Elands Bay charcoal, because that's more species specific, we had about 12,000. And then with Bourne plus pollen, because they've been identified mostly at family and genus level, there's obviously a lot more occurrences, where there were about, I think, 130,000 coordinates to go through. So once all those coordinates have been taken from the database, you can sort of start cleaning through them, removing coordinates that have too much uncertainty, removing points that have that are very clearly either planted in a botanical garden or places where you know that the rainfall, like its irrigation, is not necessarily the natural rainfall of like the land. So once we have all those points, the next thing we did was to get the actual variable data for the modern day variable data for those points. This is just showing the mean annual temperature for the 3 examples I used before. And this just sort of shows the change, the difference in sort of the modes of, this is the kernel density estimate that sort of shows the change in the amount of mean annual temperature which would be required to get each taxa. So this was done using WorldClim bioclimatic variables, and we specifically looked for mean annual temperature, total annual precipitation, and dry quarter precipitation. The reason we went for these 3, mean annual temperature, and particularly because we know we can ground it to already well-known records. So we sort of looked through that in the end very briefly. Total annual precipitation in an attempt to see if there's a sort of actual link between, to be able to link that between the last glacial maximum and southern hemisphere westerlies, and dry quarter precipitation in an attempt to look at the seasonality and a possible change in seasonality through time. Reconstructing paleoclimate. The first thing we did, this is the second part of the method, sorry. So this is reconstructing paleoclimate. The first part of it was going to be to perform a canonical correspondence analysis, from now on called a CCA. And second was going to be to do a weighted average partial least squares regression. And that's what was going to give us the reconstructed values of all those variables. So the CCA, basically what it's supposed to do is you have all of your values for, you have your values for the individual mean annual temperature, total annual precipitation, and you also have your abundance of the taxa in sort of a grid form over South Africa. So we decided to go for a 0.5 degree grid. And so what we did then was to sum all of the taxa that are found in those grids and create a relative abundance of them. And then in that same grid, average out the variables to perform the CCA. The weighted average partial least squares regression used the same sort of gridding of 0.5 degrees. And what that does is it basically fits the variable to the species abundance, similar to the CCA. Then we do a leave one out cross-validation, randomized t-tests, and then using the number of components with the lowest root mean square error. So the first part of results is a CCA, which until last year I never knew existed. So I'm so sorry if there are so many pollen people who know what this is, but I am going to explain it just a little bit because I'm not sure who we have in the Zoom call. So what this does is I've shortened obviously all the names of the flora to just 4 letters long. And the first one is of the Elands Bay pollen, as well as the the Elands Bay charcoal and the Bourne plus charcoal. And the second one is of the pollen from Elands Bay. So the different colors are the taxa groups that were given in the published literature, red being xeric thicket, orange being asteraceous, green being proteoid feinboss, yellow is mesic thicket, the dark blue is afromontane, this very bright blue is general thicket, and then we've got this purple with riverine woodland taxa. And basically what the CCA is supposed to do is show the grouping of each of these groups, of each of these taxa groups. So as we can see, in this quadrant here, we've got a lot of our xeric, 3 out of 4 of the xeric thicket that were recorded, with E. racemosa plotting further away than these 3. Mesic thicket plotting in quite a wide range, Afromontane all very close by except for Podocarpus elongatus. Another thing that this CCA is supposed to do is show the relation between the flora and the variables. So the closer to the actual line, which is the variable, is, the higher the, sorry, not the closer to the line. So these are sort of vectors of mean annual temperature, total annual precipitation, and dry quarter precipitation. The further along the line that variable plots, the higher the correlation to that taxa and the variable. So as we can see here, our Afromontane forest taxa plot quite far along the total annual precipitation variable, with the exception of something like Podocarpus elongatus. So these are sort of considerations that we have to make when we're reconstructing, because is the reason this Podocarpus is plotting so far away from total annual precipitation an actual signal or like a reasoning as to how Podocarpus elongatus grows, or is that possibly a bias, an anthropogenic bias, perhaps people favorably plant Podocarpus elongatus and that just hasn't been removed from the database. So that's sort of an example of how the CCAs were used. And then after that, we have the actual reconstructions. So this first one is a reconstruction of the Boomplas Cave charcoals. The black line is the actual reconstruction with sample-specific values being the blue line, so making a sort of envelope. And the pink line is where the LGM, where we've defined the LGM to be at 21,000. So with the Boomplas charcoals, we can see that the point closest to, for temperature, the point closest to the LGM is much lower than the last point, is lower than what our last point would be, which would be our most recent or modern value for mean annual temperature. And similarly for the precipitation, well, not similarly, but for precipitation, our value closest to the LGM is sort of, is lower than what we had at the glacial, and it sort of increases into the Holocene and goes back down. Now this sort of drop down here, as well as this point in the mean annual temperature, we have to take consideration as to what the actual the charcoal record was at those places, and quite a and at the most modern level, there was quite a high level of Acacia Karoo, which was the most recorded. It was most recorded in that level. So it's we're not really sure if we're seeing a signal of this is naturally what the vegetation was, that it really is mostly Acacia Karoo, or perhaps just in terms of how the charcoal was sampled, if that happens to be the layer that has the most Acacia Karoo. The next one is Elands Bay pollen reconstruction. So again, we see the mean annual temperature at the last glacial maximum being low and increasing into the present day. Again, a few other points that need to be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt. This point here, I'm not sure if my cursor is showing it, but it's the second point from the right. And that has quite a little bit of a peak just before going down to our last point at the LGM. At this point here, we have probably about 40% or 50% grasses. And again, we're not sure if this is perhaps if this is completely a realistic signal where a lot of the other recorded taxa were not just either genuinely weren't there, or if perhaps there's an issue with sampling. The next point, and then looking at total annual precipitation, I just need to move people to the side. We have much larger error bar but yeah, a much larger error bar. And what seems to be a possible low precipitation sort of near the LGM, it doesn't increase quite as much as in the Boomplaats cave charcoals. So yeah. And then finally, what we had the most problem with is the Elands Bay charcoal record, which looking at the mean annual temperature, I think it looks quite nice in that we can see a very clear sort of plateau. Well, it's a plateau because there's only 2 points, but there's a sort of clearer low temperatures in what we think is the glacial period, and then a sharp increase, but this increase happens a little bit before 21,000. And then a whole lot of Holocene sort of signals here that fluctuate, and then back to modern day values, which are much higher than what we'd expect. We know that modern day mean annual temperature on average should not be around 20 degrees, but here we are. And then with the total annual precipitation, we get this quite interesting plot where we have negative, very, very, very negative precipitation values. This was quite interesting because having tried everything to get them to positive values, just doing everything we could to get them to positive values, this sort of made us rethink sort of the validity or how good this method is for certain data sets. So a big difference between the Elands Bay charcoal data set and the others is that it is very, the charcoals have been identified to species level. So we have quite small sort of corridors where these taxa exist, and there isn't much of a gradual gradient, where with the pollen, if you have, for example, Celestracia, which exists over quite a lot of South Africa, but obviously has pockets where it's a lot more common and other pockets where it isn't. I think the weighted average partially squares regression model is able to better reconstruct if it has a good environmental gradient over which these taxa plot. So we think that could be a possible reason to this horrible, horrible plot with negative, 1,000 millimeters rainfall at the LGM. And then just to compare it, just as a quick comparison with other records, we have here the Congo Cave stalagmite and the predicted temperature values, obviously with a little bit of a gap. This was just to look a little bit at the magnitude of change we could be expecting. So in our results, we're seeing a magnitude of about 4, maybe 5 degrees, whereas the Congo Cave stalagmite shows 5, 6, even sometimes 7 degrees difference between the last glacial maximum and the present. Let me go to the next slide. Then to just sort of look at the Lisicki-Ramo-Benthic core to see the timing of, to be able to see a little bit more in terms of timing of the LGM. So with our proposed, 21,000, which is seen in a few of the plots, looking at sort of a more bigger picture, 21,000 is still going into the LGM, so maybe not quite there yet. So considerations moving forward. I've sort of hinted a little bit at these while moving through the slides, but obviously the biases between collecting charcoal and pollen are some very big considerations. Charcoal, I think in a lot of the charcoal records, the more modern day strat points were I think we sort of ended up seeing quite a gearing towards xeric thicket, which could be, because generally xeric thicket probably burns better. So it's trying to figure out which signal are we seeing that is possibly an actual signal of change in climate and what is maybe a bias that's anthropogenic, as well as pollen records. I'm not too well versed into the biases, but I think things like transport biases would obviously play a part into these caves, such which pollens would be transported better. Looking at GBIF database versus pollen traps, I think we had a few problems with the GBIF database because of the nature of it, in that if two people see the same tree, we could both essentially record it into the same database. So are we seeing is it two trees there, or is it one tree recorded by a few people? So there's the possibility for things being doubled up, as well as because it isn't done by the same person, the actual recording is never uniform. So in some places where they explain to you this point was taken at, for example, Kirstenbosch Botanical Garden, someone else might not specify that that point is from a botanical garden, so you might not actually think to remove it. And then just the fact that the method, I think, from what we've experienced, works best with widespread occurrences rather than your more specific species occurrences that exist in very sort of narrow environmental gradients. And I think this method possibly could have potential for other sites that have well reconstrained LGM and glacial periods. I think it would be very interesting to sort of look at to be able to ground it with the glacial period as well. We didn't have a lot of points other than at Elands Bay of the actual the last glacial period. And then as well as that, to possibly extend this to Boonplaas pollen record, as well as any other Southern Cape pollen, just to better see what the pollen record without this sort of anthropogenic bias would look like. And so with all these considerations, if we could just for a hot second throw them out the window and see what it actually could possibly say. I've made this plot that normalizes all the reconstructions on a scale of 0 to 1, just to normalize it and remove sort of the error bars just to clean it up a little bit. And for mean annual temperature, we can see sort of a much colder period compared to wetter from the last glacial and including last glacial maximum into sort of your later Holocene dates. And in terms of your precipitation, the general trend with a little pinch of salt was a much drier sort of LGM going into increasing precipitation into after your LGM and into the Holocene. So what this could mean would either be a poleward shift or a decreased intensity, perhaps, in the Southern Hemisphere westerlies. I think another thing to perhaps take into consideration is the magnitude of these changes, if they're enough to even make, such a statement on polewards or equatorwards shifts in the Southern Hemisphere westerlies. But if, we had to choose either polewards or equatorwards, I think this data would more likely vie for a polewards shift in the Southern Hemisphere westerlies. And that is everything. Thank you so much. And a big thank you again to the organizers of SASQUA. I know this was supposed to happen last week, but obviously due to very unforeseen circumstances, we had to move it to this week. So big thank you, and thank you for everyone for their patience and agreeing to move everything to this week.
Thanks so much, Wendy. We're going to move swiftly along and keep any questions for afterwards. We're running a tiny bit late, so now the floor is all yours, Brian. Did you unmute?
Hey, I can do this. Share screen. Tink. Yep. Hold on. I'll get there. Stop share. Share screen. Other side. There we go. Okay. Is that up? Okay, good. So I'm presenting some work on behalf of my co-authors, Chris Harris, Maarten de Wit, Jan Kramers, Sean Dole, and Jacek Stankovic. This is work that has been in the works since certainly before I started working in quaternary science, and probably before many of you were born. But this is an effort to get something to see the light of day with sort of maximum effect. In putting this together, it was, I sort of started from a baseline, and then the question is posed, what does higher latitude versus low latitude forcing mean? So I've kind of stepped back a few levels just to make sure that everybody is on the same page and follows along. Basically, what I mean when I say high latitude versus low latitude forcing, I think what is generally meant is that at orbital timescales, multi-millennial patterns of climate change are primarily driven by orbital parameters. But the way that these changes influence the Earth system as a whole can basically be broken down into high latitude and low latitude components. High latitude forcing generally relates to the sort of big glacial interglacial changes we think about, and the way that insolation changes and variability result in larger continental ice sheets in the northern hemisphere, generally speaking. And there's a whole chain reaction of effects that come from that, and this sort of synthesizes it in a really general way, where with these massive ice sheets, you get the westerlies in both hemispheres kind of being edged equatorward. You have an intensification of these high pressure cells over the oceans, and you have the thermal equator, the ITCZ or African rain belt. Oh, Jesus God. Changing the impact of the position of the ITCZ. And because there's more ice in the north, the displacement is more towards the south, even though there is something of a contraction at the same time. So this is what I mean when I mean high latitude forcing, things which are essentially mediated through the high northern latitudes related to the development of ice sheets. On the flip side, low latitude forcing relates to direct insolation forcing of the global monsoon regions and the tropical rainfall regions, which are shown here in green. Obviously, there is rainfall over Canada and these other places, but this is specifically tropical monsoonal rainfall. And this relates to the amount and seasonal distribution of solar insolation. We see this on a daily, annual, seasonal basis, where insolation changes northern to southern, summer to winter, and surface temperature follows along. Sea surface temperatures a little bit more slowly, and precipitation in the tropical regions as well, back and forth across Africa, following the zone of maximum summer insolation. The parameters that we're considering, the first one is primarily eccentricity, because it's the longest cycle that we're talking about. And it's the one that, to a degree, I mean, it affects the amount of insolation. It's the only orbital parameter that affects the amount of insolation that the Earth actually receives. And the change in the Earth's orbit varies at a range of different cycles, from best known is probably a 100,000 year cycle. But the strongest one is actually a 400,000 year cycle. And it extends even to these grand cycles of 2.4 million years and 9.6 million years. Much weaker signals, but still existing. So as the amount of insolation that the Earth receives changes, there's also the seasonal distribution of that. And there's this wobble in the Earth's orbit that's referred to as precession. And it determines the season at which the Earth is closest to the sun. And this varies at a 23,000 year cycle. So it'll go from northern to southern hemispheres. And you get something where you have the eccentricity signal here, but playing in under that, the amount is received at a season as a function of precession. So what this does to the monsoon regions is essentially when you have stronger summer radiation and weaker winter radiation, you have the Earth warming, you have a strong summer monsoon with lots of water being advected off the oceans and coming into these big convective rainfall systems falling over land. And during low summer insolation, you have the opposite. And what this does, this is just an idealized circumstance, where with high eccentricity here, positive high summer insolation, you get more rainfall. And this shifts back and forth at a 23,000 year period. Note that this diminishes, the response diminishes with eccentricity, but it remains positive in theory. I say in theory, in some places, in fact, here's a 600,000 year record from China, very well known. And you can see clearly that the amplitude and timing of change is very, very similar to this eccentricity mediated climatic index based on precession. So when you have high summer insolation, you have wetter, warmer conditions in this region of the northern hemisphere. There's a thing that Robyn and other people have mentioned, which is called the orbital monsoon hypothesis, which is basically recognizing the anti-phase relationship between the hemispheres. That when you have high summer insolation in the northern hemisphere, it's low in the southern hemisphere. And so you have this anti-phase relationship between precipitation amounts in the rainfall zones of each hemisphere, in the tropics of each hemisphere. You can see here, Brazil versus China, this generally plays out. The importance of this is that it's a really good mechanistic framework for interpreting these long models. I mean, Lydie has shown this. I mean, here's a way that we can understand why these things might be happening, why these observations might exist. And it's also good because when you don't have a record, you can still kind of guess at what maybe was happening based on these mechanics. So you probably are all familiar with this, is the Partridge Record. And this has been used to support that. It's a contentious record. There's kind of been a lot of discussion about it. But you can see that it works for much of the record until it doesn't. But then it does again. And this is unfortunately about the period of radiocarbon dating. So there's been a lot of things. The only well-dated part of the record doesn't fit. So how good is this model? How good is this interpretation? Which is a reasonable question. So what we did was we looked at these records from Congo Cave and then from Efflux Cave, which Kirsten Braun and colleagues have worked on. And then I added in a little Seve-Vieksport component, which you'll see in a minute because I have to talk about Hare in some time. And you can see that Congo Cave and Efflux Cave are on just opposite sides of the Swartberg Mountains. Vegetation is not utterly dissimilar. This is, red is rainfall seasonality. You can see that it's a bit more seasonal on the north side and there's a little bit less rain on the north side. But by and large, the climates of these two regions is not, it's not orders of magnitude off. We didn't initially think to compare these, but once we did, we thought the results were interesting enough to share. So the Congo Cave, what's great about it is one of the rare deep cave systems in Southern Africa. It's a seminal site of the 1992 Tama record that Wendy just showed as an example. It's used a lot. The issue is that the sampling resolution and strategy was such that the record is poorly resolved in terms of the sampling interval, but also the speleothems were more or less destroyed in the sampling process. So we unfortunately can't go back and replicate the record, which is part of the reason why it's been sitting on the shelf for so long. What's valuable is that it's an independent point of comparison for Xueqin. And it's ideally located to sort of assess these changes in the summer rainfall zone. Did it expand? Did it contract? What's going on at this sort of climatic margin between these rainfall regimes? So what we did was we combined this speleothem record here, which is the Congo one, which we have in dark blue and sort of this dark brown. I'm not sure if the resolution works out, but this earlier part of the record, later part of the record is the Tama and Vogel record. And you can see that while there's a bit of décalage, there's a bit of difference between the two. We're not a million miles off. There are two different speleothems from the same cave, and you may think, oh, well, they should be showing the same thing. That's fundamentally not the case. I mean, you look at what Kirsten has done, or anybody from any cave site pretty much around the world, you don't get the exact same record from two different speleothems in the same cave, or it's very rare. But we have a reasonable age model for this. It's a very deep cave, saturated conditions, perfect for getting environmental signal from these. There's no kinetic effects to be noted. But in putting this together, what we had to do is, of course, we had to account for the fact that these are different sites. And indeed, even the speleothems within a site are likely to have different records because the water filtering into the cave doesn't come through the exact same vegetation. And if you have more grass or more trees, more shrubs, you need to account for that. What we're interested in here is the underlying signal, not necessarily the amplitude of change, but really just the timing and direction of change. So what we have here is we got the green, the efflux cave record, and a Tallman-Vogel record. And we used a reduced major axis regression just to, essentially, we used the Congo record as a baseline. And we assessed the relationship between the different records and created a common record based on the linchpin of the Congo record. And again, we're not looking at exact values. We're not saying, oh, it's 8.5 per mil, that means it's X. We're looking at the timing and direction of the signals. When we do this for all the speleothems we consider from efflux cave and Congo cave, this is the result. You get nearly continuous records. The D13C is incorporating the sub-export Hare exhibition D13C, which is very similar to these other records. And with this composite record, we get some very coherent patterns. And you can see this, the bottom of these two panes, the orange is the Xueqin crater record and the purple is our Delta 13C. And what we interpret the Delta 13C as meaning, higher values are more C4 grasses, more summer rainfall. And that fits very well with what we're seeing actually in the Xueqin crater record. When they have more summer rainfall, we have more summer rainfall. Including that with the decline in summer precipitation, with decreasing eccentricity across the last glacial cycle, you get this decline in rainfall. But there is a threshold that is crossed about 70,000 years ago, where indeed the relationship between precession and summer rainfall breaks down. And you no longer have this same in-phase response to this forcing mechanism. What we've done here, the bottom pane, it's a semblance analysis. So it looks at variability within the precessional band, and blue is a negative relationship and red is a positive relationship, positive correlation. And you can see when you compare the Xueqin crater record with the Gulf of Aden record, that there's this predicted negative antiphase response up to 70,000 years ago. When you have strong precessional forcing, the two hemispheres are operating in antiphase, according to the orbital monsoon hypothesis. But at about 70,000 years ago, bang, breaks down, and you get an in-phase relationship, a strong in-phase relationship between the two hemispheres. This basically relates to significant ice sheath development and strong high latitude forcing. Looking at the oxygen isotope records, we don't interpret the oxygen isotope records too much because they're complex. As if you've read any papers on oxygen isotope records in Southern Africa, you will know that. There's no one size fits all interpretation that can be applied across the whole sequence. It just doesn't exist. However, when we do have strong precessional forcing, when we do have this expanded, we infer, summer rainfall zone, the results are consistent with a strong amount effect, where you have lower values with more rainfall. And you have an antiphase relationship, again, between the Chinese speleothems here in blue, and, in orange, and the Cape Fold composite, which we call it, the Congo and efflux cave record, in orange. But again, that stops at about 70,000 years ago. And you end up with the two records being strongly in phase thereafter. This suggests that prior to 70,000 years ago, low latitude insulation forcing was dominant and was primarily controlled by amount effect. And we infer an expanded summer rainfall zone. After 70,000, again, the records between the northern and southern tropics are in phase, and indeed the oxygen isotope changes to sort of a quasi 41,000-year obliquity cycle, which again primarily affects high latitudes and therefore indicates high latitude forcing rather than low latitude forcing. Unlike the 13C record, 18O remains in phase in the Holocene, which suggests that as eccentricity has decreased since the last interglacial period, that it has not increased the amount that we're going to, that it goes back into an anti-phase response. So that low eccentricity maintains an in-phase relationship in the oxygen isotope records, which isn't necessarily reflected in the 13C. So just to sum that up, 13C and 18O records from Congo Cave had allowed us to create this composite record, which we feel broadly reflects regional changes. It's not precise, it's not exact, and you certainly don't want to look at the absolute values as being indicative of X, Y, or Z changes in proportions of C3 versus C4. But we do find utility in this composite. And they corroborate, which I found to be a slightly dodgy Xueqin crater record. And I'm sort of much happier seeing that for what Tim has always said it was, or always said it was before he passed. And that from 113 to about 70, the orbital monsoon hypothesis is supported by these records, and you have this anti-phase relationship between the hemispheres. But with decreasing eccentricity and the development of these high latitude ice sheets, the northern and southern tropical records move in phase, indicating that high latitude forcing starts to dominate this region. And this highlights the constraints on the orbital monsoon hypothesis, that it should not be applied all the time everywhere as the holy grail for why my record did this. And we also see that there's not really a one-size-fits-all interpretation for the water isotope records. We believe that there's a strong amount of effect when it's within the summer rainfall zone, but once that dominance changes and you move to a high latitude dominance, it becomes complicated. There's a range of reasons why it might be doing what it's doing, but I don't feel like we really have a basis for a truly robust interpretation of those records yet. That's that. Sorry, rambling. I spend too much time at home. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Brian. Should we take some questions for Brian?